In today's video, we're going to be discussing some pros and cons when dealing with rent control. Rent control has been a hot topic of debates in recent years. Even if you don't work in a market that currently has rent control is likely to continue expanding into new markets. So it is something you want to be aware of and have at least some idea of how to handle it if it arrives in your particular market. Different markets have different variations of how rent control is applied. These different variations will really determine how and what landlords can and cannot offer at their particular assets. One of the most common dynamics of rent control is how rent control controls and limits what the landlord can offer to any resident for their renewal offer. Due to this and how rent control is applied, most often in a lot of markets, the rent control dynamic really only applies to the renewal side. Like anything, with the perspective of residents and landlords, there is positives and negatives to rent control. In today's video, we're going to be reviewing 3 pros and 3 cons when dealing with rent control from a landlord and/or tenant's perspective. The first pro when dealing with rent control is really dealing with planning. When you have rent control in place and you're limiting how much you can charge when it comes to renewals or even other aspects of your particular market that your asset is in, it's really easy to plan when it comes to this. You know what's the max amount you may be able to achieve. You know the likelihood when it comes to probably things like turnover cost. There's also other areas that rent control will affect that help you when it comes to your planning. Things like vacancy loss, turnover cost, make-ready cost, vendor cost, and this is why it's really important to actually know your limitations of rent control in your particular market, even if it hasn't started yet when it comes to your planning for any type of budget you're working on. The first con that we're going to be discussing today when dealing with rent control is that most markets that have rent control in them, you tend to have less investors that are coming into that market and building and developing assets for any residential property. This typically results in less competition and less options for residents when it comes to that particular area. That is typically not a good thing. What typically happens then is the residents are going to be forced to go to a smaller amount of communities that don't offer less or maybe outdated when it comes to amenities or other things. So this is why you don't necessarily want rent control in particular areas. And this has been an argument for years is that, hey, it's going to be more affordable for residents, but the downside is you're going to have less supply because less investors are going to be interested in investing in that particular area that rent control exists. And to me, I think this is probably the biggest con of rent control. I have personally seen it myself where certain markets that have rent control, they also don't have a lot of investor interest or new developments over time. And this is not a good thing, both for the competition aspect for your team and for landlords, but also for the resident side as well, because they don't have as many options. And also keep in mind as a resident, if you don't have as many options, where landlords then are able to increase rents, they're going to get much more aggressive because they know you don't have a lot of options and other places to go. So you're really going to have a dynamic where residents have a small list of properties they probably are willing to consider in that particular area that there is rent control due to the lack of investors. Welcome back to Property Management 101. For those of you that are new here, please allow me to introduce you to our community. This channel is dedicated to discussing best practices, offering valuable tips, and sharing tricks that are tailored specifically to the property management industry. You may have noticed there is an abundance of podcasts, channels, and websites out there providing information that's related to the property management industry. However, much of this content is focused on catering to investors and to property owners really maximizing their investments. Here is where we stand out. Our channel is created with you, the individuals in the trenches, in mind. We are here to support those that are actively involved in managing properties, ensuring that not only your efforts are worthwhile, but also highly effective. So whether you're a seasoned professional or you're new to the property management industry, you've come to the right place. Join us as we dive into proven practices for the property management industry, and we'll be discussing many different types of demographic and asset types in the property management industry. Thank you for being a part of our community, and we look forward to engaging with you on this exciting journey in the property management space. The second pro when dealing with rent control in your particular market is that you tend to have a low turnover. This typically results with a high renewal conversion, low amount of turn costs, less stress for staff. You typically are able to maintain a higher occupancy, and you typically have a low vacancy loss as well. This is why it's really good from a landlord perspective to have rent control, because residents tend to stick where they're at and not necessarily bounce from property to property as often, because of the dynamic where the landlord is limited on the renewal side of what they can offer, and residents know that. So they know if they go to a new property, they're not nearly going to get the same rate in the event they decided to elect to stay at their current property. This is great from a staffing perspective, because if you don't have a lot of units to turn, you don't have a lot of costs when it comes to vendor cost or turn costs. This could save the property thousands of dollars, even though it may limit when it comes to your rent growth at that particular property. The second con when it comes to rent control is that you tend to have very high new lease trade out rates. So what I'm referring to is when a resident moves out, in a lot of areas that have rent control, you're not limited when a resident moves out what you are able to charge that new resident coming in. What happens in these situations in a rent control particular market is you tend to have landlords really try to offset what they were limited to on the renewal side with much higher rates on the new lease side. So this is where you see a big gap between renewal pricing and new lease pricing. So this is why too you also tend to have a higher renewal conversion in rent control markets. Now for residents, this is not a good thing, because if you have to move for one reason or another, you're probably going to get a much higher rate than if you were to elect to stay at your particular property, or if you're moving into a market that has rent control. So you tend to see much higher increases on the new lease side because of rent control, and this can negatively impact residents because they may not be able to afford that particular area or that particular floor plan at your property, simply because of how much that landlord's pushing their new lease rates to offset what they're limited to on the renewal side. If you're enjoying this video and you're learning something new, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for future videos. And for the third pro, when it comes to rent control in your particular market, you tend to have a great morale when it comes to your residents. So when in a rent control area, like I mentioned earlier, what you typically have is a high conversion when it comes to your renewals. Well, residents know most likely they're staying at that particular property if they're staying in the area. So they tend to find themselves more engaged as far as what's going on in the area, more communication going on between them and the staff. They have more of a sense of community, knowing they're less likely to leave that particular asset. This is a good thing for the staff. This is a good thing for the residents. This is a good thing for the community. So because of this, you really have a strong sense of community typically at rent control sites compared to a site that's very similar to a non-rent control market. This is great for tenant interactions, this is great for tenant morale, and also in turn that helps the staff's morale. So having a really strong morale, real positive morale amongst all the community members is a really good thing when it comes to your particular asset. And the third con when it comes to rent control in your particular area is that a lot of times, because of the dynamic that you have a high conversion and your staff has a good morale and the resident client base has a good morale with them because they're most likely going to stay at that particular community, one dynamic I've seen often is that the staff is less motivated. And this is due to a number of reasons. Usually because the occupancy is high, they don't have a lot of beds or units to fill. Because of this, are not as motivated as if they had a lot of units to fill, as far as to follow up with leads, provide that high level of service, ensure the model path is clean, ensure the model is showing well. So you tend to find staffs more likely than not at rent control properties and rent control markets have a dynamic where they're not as motivated, especially on the new lease side. This is something that tends to also trickle down in other areas because the properties in a lot of areas can be very easily successful in a rent control market because they have that high conversion on the renewal side, high occupancy, low amount of vacancy. Then it tends to have a dynamic where the staff isn't as motivated as a staff that may have a lot of exposure, a lot of vacancy, a lot of units to turn. So it is a dynamic where you tend to find staffs not as motivated as other sites that are not dealing with rent control. And for a video recap today, please keep in mind these 3 pros and these 3 cons when it comes to rent control in your particular market. The first pro is planning. Sometimes rent control with certain line items make it easier to plan for because of the limitations that rent control offer. The first con is less investors, and this is the biggest one that I think is the most impactful in these particular markets that rent control exist. When you have less investors in a particular market, you're going to have the dynamic residents have less options of where to move to. The second pro when it comes to rent control is you have a low amount of turnover. This means a high amount of renewal conversion. This means a low cost from vendor costs, make-ready costs, turn cost, vacancy loss. So because of this, you tend to have a lot of benefits with a low amount of turnover. The second con when it comes to rent control is that you tend to have very high new lease rates. This is to offset the limitations they have on the renewal side. So this is something that's often the case where you tend to have a bigger spread between renewal rates and new lease rates in rent control markets. The last pro when it comes to rent control is you really have a good resident morale. Because residents know they're less likely to move somewhere else because of the cost benefit to staying, you do have the dynamic where residents have more of a sense of community, better communication with the staff, and more eagerness to make it really their long-term home. And the last con when it's dealing with rent control in a particular market is that staffs tend to be not as motivated as staffs outside of a rent control market. This is because the staffs at a rent control market tend to have easier time to have a higher renewal conversion, less vacancy, higher occupancy, and they don't have the dynamic where they have to put as much effort into a property's make-ready times, their vacancy, as well as other dynamics when it comes to leasing. So this is why it's really important when you're dealing with staff with rent control, you're keeping that in mind as far as finding ways to keep their motivation high when dealing with rent control property. If you enjoyed this video and you learned something new, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for future videos. Before putting any of these practices into place, please watch our updated disclosure video as well as our updated why we do this video, which is the channel's why. And I'll be providing a link to both of those in the video description. And to stay on top of industry news, polls, and video releases, please feel free to connect with our LinkedIn and our Instagram page. If you have any questions about this video or any of our videos, feel free to leave a comment. I'll be happy to address it for you. Happy leasing!